going since the Neolithic, seem to me in many cases to carry along as one of the appurtenances of the Gailanic sensibility, devotion to this particular drug and this particular plant above all others. Anybody want to jump in here?
Well, only a small question to start with. Since the leaves of the male plant do have a pharmacological effect, I just wondered if you had anything to say on your experience of comparing the effects of the two.
Well, only in that if it has a pharmacological effect, it's orders of magnitude more weakened than the female. One thing I might say, we in the 20th century tend to smoke our cannabis. I mean, aside for the occasional holiday cannabis cookie, cannabis for us is something that is smoked. On the other hand, for the 19th century, and for all of European civilization, cannabis was something that was eaten in the form of various sugared confections that were prepared. And this method of ingestion changes cannabis into an extremely powerful psychedelic experience. I mean, if you read the accounts of people like Theodore Gautier or Baudelaire or Fitzhugh Ludlow, written in the mid-19th century, they are describing experiences that obviously were for them as powerful as a 500 microgram dose of LSD proved in our own lifetimes. And we forget this. We tend to think of it as a social drug and a kind of a minor drug on a par with smoking a cigarette or having a cognac or something like that. But in fact, for the serious eater of hashish, there it is the portal into a true artificial paradise whose length and breadth is equal to that of any of the artificial paradises that we've discovered in modern psychedelic pharmacology. To my mind, the whole of by Oriental I mean Indian and Middle Eastern civilization, is steeped in the ambiance of hashish. I mean, the Mosque of Omar, for example, is a beautiful example of the aesthetic of hashish at work, or Jama Masjid in Delhi, or the interiors of the mosques of Isfahan. This ideal of sensual beauty, of the richness of abstract design and vaulting spaces and vast concourses of polished marble and travertine, these seem to be the motifs of hashish in the same way that the Gothic vision of black ocean waters sucking at haunted islands is a part of the repertoire of the opium vision that so entranced the Romantic poets. Hashish, cannabis, has an ambiance of its own. It has a morphogenetic field, and if you enter into that morphogenetic field, you enter into an androgynous, softened, abstract, colorful, an extraordinarily beautiful world. And in our own time, it seems to me the intense hatred of hashish and the efforts to eradicate it that reach hysterical proportions in our own country have nothing to do with the pharmacological impact of the drug or any deleterious effect that it might be perceived to have, but rather it is sensed as the carrier of a different set of cultural values, which I would broadly describe as Gaian or Gailanic. or feminizing or androgynous, and that this is what really brings the opprobrium of the dominator society upon it. It is profoundly disloyal to the values of modern industrialism, where, for instance, a drug like caffeine, exemplified in coffee and tea, has been made very welcome in those same societies. I mean, no other drug other than caffeine has ever been written into the industrial contracts of workers as an inalienable right, and yet in the coffee break we encounter contractually defined rights to drug use that seem to work in favor of both manager and worker. Cannabis is very different. It promotes a dreaminess. It promotes an abiding in the imagination that is the stuff of romantic poetry rather than the stuff of the modern assembly line. And I've used it that way as a tool for creativity. I mean, it's incredible how just a few puffs of cannabis can carry you over a creative problem or a block in seeing a particular problem, so that suddenly the perspective shifts and what was previously occluded becomes patently obvious. So I think that there's a great argument for above and beyond the well-known and familiar arguments for legalizing this drug, that it would provide revenue for governments, that it would decriminalize a class of people who, if it weren't for their devotion to cannabis products, would be seen to be among the most law-abiding of all classes within society. These arguments are familiar and have been made very eloquently by other people. But behind that, there's a deeper issue, which is the zeitgeist, if you will, of cannabis, which carries a certain implied danger to establishment values, which put such a premium on clear-eyed hard work and Presbyterian rectitude.
Well, I think it's interesting that in countries like Egypt and India, where cannabis has been used for millennia and accepted as part of society, that now, both under the influence of the United States foreign policy and of industrialism, there's now attempts to suppress or stamp it out. Countries like Malaya, where it's been accepted as part of Kampong life for many, many generations, now there are strict laws, draconian attempts to stop people smoking it.
And death penalty.
Even death penalties. So it's true that there's a shift in valuation taking place, imposed by the West, going together with industrialism, which is happening, and it's clear that this is something to do with this change in consciousness. It's also clear that in the 19th century there was a very different attitude on behalf of Western powers, and cannabis was not illegal in Western countries, and indeed in India. The British government in India operated a cannabis monopoly. The cannabis trade was the monopoly of the government, and this continued in parts of India, like Uttar Pradesh and in Pakistan, until quite recently. Maybe it still goes on. But when I was last in Lahore, in the bazaar there's a little shop, says over the door, government opium shop, and this shop deals in cannabis and opium, and is still, or was still, part of the government monopoly. So different attitudes have prevailed at different times, but it's clear that the modern industrial consciousness is alien to cannabis, and I suppose it's clear that the growth of what you'd call Gaian consciousness from the 1960s onwards is closely linked to it. Most people I know who smoke it have started in the 1960s or subsequently. I know very few who were familiar with its use before then. There must always have been some, but it was presumably the explosion of consciousness in the 1960s was closely associated with the explosion of cannabis and other psychedelic substances. Well, given all these facts, and given the strong case you make for its benevolent effects, what I'm interested in is why Ralph, who was also present on the scene in the 1960s, is no enemy of the effect of psychedelics, has spent so many years as a total abstainer.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you because I had an extremely positive attitude toward cannabis. I personally made the acquaintance in 1966, so a year after Terence, around my 30th birthday, and I discovered immediately on first smoking more or less some of these beneficial effects, even though I had no culture around me, mythological interpretation and tradition of cannabis appreciation. Nevertheless, I saw at once these functions of the deconstruction of character armor and rigid mental structures opening up for free roving enormous terrains of intellectual territory, synthetic effect of resonance between previously isolated rooms in the mental mansion. And in 1968 there came into my possession by some miracle a large amount of synthetic THC in caps, which I circulated among friends, many of whom were mathematicians. And this oral ingestion does produce, I guess, what a smoker of cannabis would call an overdose, basically, and a very, well, benign psychedelic experience. Then, after moving to Santa Cruz in 1968, where the hip subculture was thriving, all events were accompanied by smoking joints, and my main impression of it is what Terence described on the relationship of hemp and stories. I've learned this word diaphanous from you, Terence, thinking of triaphanous, the triaphanous web that we weave in our meetings, this kind of strong coupling, enhanced resonance was, in my experience, characteristic of the cannabis experience. So we started with the chant Om Namo Shivaya, and in India the smoking of charas is a most strongly it's a form of puja for Shiva. Daniel Rue has emphasized the history of the Shaivite religion as preceding the arrival of the Indo-Europeans, the Aryans, into India. It's associated with the Dravidians now reigning in the south of India. And he identifies also this Shaivite religion, prehistoric religion, with Orphism. In Greece, Shiva, Orpheus, this is the same. So the association of cannabis and Gylany, I think, is a very reasonable conjecture on prehistory, that cannabis was an important crop in Mino and Crete, was an important ingredient in the Dionysian revels before alcohol took over. It was the maybe the secret and most important ingredient in the maintenance of the dynamic partnership societies of the prehistoric past. Therefore, the fact that its arrival into mass use, breaking into mass use through college campuses in the 1960s, did give birth to the hip subculture, gave rebirth to the resurgence wave